I was flat on my stomach behind a ridge of scorched rock, counting muzzle flashes from across the valley when Private Leon Addy tapped my boot twice. 2 taps meant he had eyes on a secondary position. 3 taps would have meant we were already dead. I was grateful for 2. 6 of us, 12 of them. The math was their idea, not mine. Corporal Yemi Alade was 3M to my left, doing something with a comm antenna and a field knife that I had made a personal decision not to look at. Whatever it was working. The enemy's targeting signals had been breaking apart for the last 4 minutes. Their shots landing wide, their coordination fracturing at the edges. Yemi had that effect on electronic systems. She also had that effect on people, but that was a different problem for a different moon. Private Leon rolled up beside me. He had the expression he always wore when he was doing arithmetic, which was the expression most people wore when they were watching their house burn down. Focused, grieving, committed. 2 charges, he said. That rock ledge uphill of their left flank. I looked at the ledge. I looked at him. That's uphill. I know. The explosion goes downhill. The rock goes uphill, he said. Then it goes downhill. The math works out. The math should not have worked out. I want to be clear about that. What Leon did with physics on a regular basis was the kind of thing that made engineers drink. But he had this quality, this absolute certainty in the arithmetic of chaos. That meant when he said the math worked out, you taped the charges to the rock and you threw it uphill. We threw it uphill. The ledge came down on their left position like a fist made of geology. What happened next took 4 minutes. I will not walk through all of it because some of it was Yemi's antenna work, and I still do not fully understand what she built, and some of it was Corporal Otto Mensa doing what Otto always did, which was move through a situation the way water moves through anything, quietly, finding every gap, going where the pressure was lowest. And some of it was the 3 others. Private Claire Finch, Private Owen Dre, and Specialist Bev Asa doing what trained humans do when the map runs out, which is improvise with a commitment that borders on personal offense. The Vratha unit did not die. I want to be clear about that too. They retreated, scattered, called for backup in a language our intercept equipment rendered as a very long, very distressed vowel sound. 12 soldiers in combat rigs that cost more than my entire forward operating base, rooted across a valley floor, calling for help they should not have needed against odds they should never have lost. 6 of us walked out of that crater. I filed the report that evening. Mission type reconnaissance, outcome successful, enemy engagement incidental, casualties our side 0. I checked the box, submitted it. Me coffee from a packet that tasted like someone had described coffee to a person who had never had coffee, who had then written instructions for a machine that had also never had coffee. I drank it anyway. The moon had a name before we got here. I never learned it. That is the part I keep coming back to. Not the charges or the antenna or the uphill rock. The name. We landed. We completed a reconnaissance sweep of 3 grid sectors. We got ambushed by a forward unit of an interstellar empire. And we walked out 6 people, 4 days, into a deployment that was supposed to be observational, no real army behind us, no fleet in orbit, just 6 people in a coffee packet and a mission classification that said Recon. I did not think about it much at the time. That is also something I keep coming back to. There's a version of this story where I'm dramatic about it, where the weight of what we did settles on my shoulders, like something cinematic, and I stare at the twin moons, one of which apparently had a name we never learned, and I feel the magnitude of the moment. There is a version where Yemi says something profound and Claire looks quietly proud, and Owen cracks a joke that cuts through the tension, and we all share a beat of hard-won soldier's peace. That is not what happened. What happened is that Yemi disassembled the antenna back into its original components and packed it neatly into her kit, which was a thing she always did and which still amazed me every time. What happened is that Leon did a final sweep of the crater because he said he had left a piece of equipment behind, and then came back holding a single pen, which he had apparently dropped during the ambush and which mattered to him for reasons I had stopped trying to understand. Owen said the words he always said after an engagement, which were not profound and are not worth repeating, but which were very much his. Claire checked her boots. Otto counted his rounds. Bev looked at the valley. That went fine, she said. That was it. That was the debrief. We walked back to the extraction point, and the shuttle took us up, and I slept for the first time in 4 days in a seat that was designed for a species with a different number of elbows, with my jacket over my face and the hum of the engines doing the thing engine hum always does, which is convince your body that everything is someone else's problem. For a while, when I woke up, we were in orbit. The mission was done. I thought about the Vrathi soldiers crossing that valley floor in the dark, calling for backup, their targeting systems dissolved by whatever Yemi had built from a field knife and 60 cm of comm wire. I thought about 12 soldiers in elite combat rigs who had done everything correctly and still lost, because correctly assumes your opponent is playing a game you both recognize. We were not playing a game they recognized. I do not know if that is a comfort or not. I have not decided. What I know is this: we were a recon unit, 6 people, routine sweep, no support, no backup, no orbital coverage. Worth mentioning, the Vrathi Empire had held this moon for 2 years before we got there. Their unit was well trained, well equipped, positioned on high ground with a numbers advantage and a tactical setup that should have ended us before we got our boots properly dirty. And they retreated, scattered, called home. And I checked the box on a form. Mission type: reconnaissance. Outcome: successful. That is the whole story of that Tuesday. That is all it was. We had 3 more grid sectors to sweep the following week, and then a resupply run on the far side of the contested zone, and after that there was talk of a forward observation post that needed 6 people in a specific skill set, and I was already thinking about the coffee situation, because whoever was stocking the forward bases had a philosophy about instant coffee that I found genuinely troubling. The war, such as it was, continued. We continued with it. Not because we were heroes, not because we were fearless, mostly because the form had a box and the box needed checking, and there was no box that said what actually happened on that crater ridge on a moon whose name I never learned. If there had been, I would have checked that one too. I am very good at checking boxes. Leon still has the pen. Admiral Veth Saren read the preliminary Report 3 times before her analysts arrived. She read it the first time the way she read every report, which was fast. Clinical, parsing data in the order of strategic significance. She read it, though, second time more slowly. By the third time, she was reading it the way she had not read a document since her first year at the Imperial War College, which was carefully checking her own comprehension, making sure that words were saying what she thought they were saying. They were 12 soldiers, elite forward unit, combat designation Tier 1, classification exoskeletal rigs, calibrated for the local gravity and atmospheric composition of the contested moon, positioned on high ground numerically superior with targeting and coordination systems that represent 2 decades of Roth I military engineering, rooted by 6 organisms of the species designated Homo sapiens. Enemy casualties 0. Engagement duration 11 minutes. She set the report down. She did not reach for her annotation stylus. She did not reach for anything. She sat in the briefing room while it was still empty and looked at the far wall and did something she had not done in a very long time, which was nothing at all. Her analysts filed in at the appointed hour. She watched them settle, watched the junior ones avoid her eyes, watched senior analyst Vethkoreth, who had served under her for 11 years and who knew her well enough to be genuinely worried, set his data tablet on the table with the particular carefulness of someone placing a fragile object near an open flame. "Admiral," he said, "walk me through it." She said. He walked her through it. The ambush positioning had been correct. Targeting deployment had been standard for a 6-person hostile unit, which meant generous. The Vratha unit had done nothing wrong. Every procedure, every protocol, every tactical decision had been within acceptable parameters. The parameters had been wrong. "The human unit," she said when he finished. "Classification." Vethkoreth looked at his tablet. "Standard reconnaissance element. Admiral, signals intelligence placed them in the area for a grid sweep. No special designation was flagged in our intelligence file." She let that sentence complete itself in the air of the room. Standard reconnaissance element. She had built a career on understanding what words meant. Reconnaissance meant observation, information gathering, a light unit traveling fast, avoiding engagement, documenting, and withdrawing. Reconnaissance units were not designed for combat. They were not equipped for sustained engagement. They were in the military doctrine of every spacefaring species she had studied across 30 years of strategic command, the most expendable and most avoidable unit type in an order of battle. 12 of her elite soldiers had been scattered across a valley floor by 6 humans on a grid sweep. One of her junior analysts, 3rd year, not yet trained in reading the temperature of a room, said, "It may have been an anomaly, Admiral. Statistical outliers occur in all engagement data and." She looked at him. He stopped talking. He would not make that mistake again. She had that effect on junior analysts. It was one of the few effects she was currently grateful for. "Pull the full intelligence file," she said. "Everything we have on the species." The file appeared on the central display. She looked at it. She looked at the thickness of it, which was the digital equivalent of thin, assembled from long-range observational probes, pre-contact surveillance sweeps, a small number of intercepted communications in the early monitoring period, and a series of assessments produced by analysts who had never, as far as she could determine, spoken to anyone who had encountered a human being in any context other than a telescope. The file described Homo sapiens as follows in the section titled Species. Threat assessment: a moderately aggressive species demonstrating limited interstellar capability and no observable large-scale military coordination with tactical behavior consistent with early expansion, civilizations unlikely to pose strategic threat within current operational theater. Recommended classification: Tier 4. Nuisance species. No significant resource allocation required. She read that paragraph 4 times. The 4th time she noticed the date. The assessment was 18 months old. When was this file last updated? She said. Silence. When she said again, quieter, was this file last updated? Vethkorath checked the primary threat. Assessment was produced at initial contact. Admiral, supplementary observations were appended over the following 6 months. No formal revision has been completed since. 18 months, 47 engagements since first contact, 47 engagements. She now had a new reason to look at with different eyes. She pulled the engagement log. She had read it before the way she read all engagement data in aggregate tracking, trends and outcomes and resource expenditure. She had noted the win rate. It was below acceptable threshold. She had attributed it to supply line friction, unfamiliar terrain, early deployment coordination gaps. All of those things were true. She had believed them to be sufficient explanations. She looked at the log now the way she should have looked at it 8 months ago. Engagement 14, Vrati Patrol Unit 20. Soldiers standard equipment encountered by human element of undetermined size. Vrati outcome: withdrawal with significant disorganization. Human casualties not confirmed but assessed as minimal. Engagement 22, Vrati fortified position: 36 soldiers, heavy emplacements. Human unit size estimated at 8 to 12. Vrati position evacuated after 5-hour engagement. Human unit departed on foot. Direction: northwest. Engagement 31, Vrati convoy 4. Vehicles: 16 soldiers ambushed. Vrati losses: 2 vehicles. Total mission failure. Human unit 7 soldiers. Human losses none confirmed. Engagement 31 had been classified in the original report as a consequence of poor route discipline on the Vrati side. She had accepted that classification. She had been wrong to accept it. She pulled the size estimates, every engagement, every human element involved. She ran the numbers herself. Not because she did not trust her analysts, but because she needed to see the arithmetic personally. She needed it to be real in her own hands. The numbers were consistent: small units, always small sizes that in any military doctrine she had studied corresponded to recon elements, forward security details, light assault teams at most. No engagement in 47 data points had involved a human element that exceeded 12 confirmed soldiers. 12. And Rhodai forces had not won consistently against them, against units that should, by every established metric of military science, have been the least dangerous thing in a contested operational theater. She was very still for a long time, long enough that Vashkorath, who had served 11 years under her and who knew what her stillness meant, began composing what he later described as a private farewell to his career. Then she asked the question. She asked it the way a surgeon asks for an instrument. No inflection, no drama. Just the precise identification of the thing that was needed right now in this moment before anything else could happen. If that was a recon unit, she said, where is their real army? Nobody answered. Not immediately, not in the pause that followed, not in the longer pause after. The shorter one, the analysts looked at their tablets at the display, at the table surface, at the specific patch of floor in front of their own feet that suddenly seemed very interesting. Nobody answered because the intelligence file did not say. Because nobody had looked. Because 18 months ago, a group of analysts who had never been within 10 light years of a human being had looked at long-range probe data and a handful of intercepted communications and written the words Tier 4 nuisance species, and nobody had substantially questioned that assessment since. The silence in the room had a texture. She had been in briefing rooms during military defeats. She had delivered news of lost battles, failed campaigns, strategic miscalculations. She knew what the silence of bad news felt like. It was heavy and it leaned forward and it had weight and direction. This silence was different. This silence was what happened when a room full of intelligent, experienced, professionally accomplished beings simultaneously realized that they had been standing on ground they had never actually examined. And the ground was not what they had assumed, and they did not know yet how far the drop was. She let them sit in it. It was the kindest thing she could do, and also the most accurate. They needed to feel the full dimensions of the problem before they could begin to understand what solving it might cost. Then her communication terminal signaled priority channel, sector field command. She accepted it. The field report was brief. Arati. Patrol in the Karath corridor, 40. Soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, heavy equipment, had encountered a human unit. They waited for the outcome. 11 minutes passed. The patrol was gone, not destroyed, not captured, but dispersed, routed, calling for extraction from separate positions. Across a 2 km spread, equipment lost. Vehicles disabled, command structure dissolved. The human unit had been observed moving northeast after the engagement. Size 7 soldiers, direction calm and purposeful, as though they had somewhere to be and the patrol had simply been in the way. Signals intercept had pulled a fragment of human communication from the engagement period. Her translator rendered it as follows. The human unit had apparently been moving between a supply depot and a secondary position. The engagement with the 40-soldier Vrati patrol had not been their mission. It had been an interruption of their mission. The intercept identified the original mission type. Supply run. Veth Saran looked at the word for a long time. Supply run. 7 humans on a routine logistics movement had encountered 40 of her soldiers and 3 combat vehicles and had continued afterward in the direction they had originally been heading. She thought about the intelligence file. Tier 4 nuisance species. She thought about the assessment date. 18 months ago, she thought about 47 engagements and the size of every human unit involved, and the question she had asked that nobody in this room could answer. She looked at Veth Korath. I want a complete revision of the species threat assessment, she said, I want every engagement reanalyzed with new size estimations and mission type. Classifications. I want a projection of total human force. Deployment based on the unit types we have encountered, and I want to know, with whatever confidence the data supports, how many engagements we have logged that were classified by the humans themselves as something other than a combat operation. Veth Korath was writing before she finished the sentence. How long, she asked. 48 hours, Admiral. She nodded. 48 hours. She would use the time to draft a preliminary communication to High Command. She would need to choose her words with great care, because what she was about to tell them was going to be uncomfortable, and she had learned in 30 years of service that uncomfortable truths required the most precise possible language, because people who did not want to believe a thing would use any imprecision as a reason not to. What she was going to tell them was this: they had been in a war for 18 months and they had not known it, not truly. They had known about the engagements, they had known about the losses, but they had attributed those losses to factors that were, in retrospect, a form of flattery they had extended to themselves: supply friction, terrain, deployment gaps, not the possibility that the species they had classified as a nuisance was, in some way they did not yet understand, doing something their military science had no adequate framework for. She dismissed the briefing. The analysts filed out. Vethkarith was last at the door. He paused. Admiral, he said. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. She was already reading the engagement log again, from the beginning this time. Engagement 1. 12 humans, Vrathi observation post, 40 soldiers. Vrathi outcome, full withdrawal. Mission classification, human side, unconfirmed. She stared at that last entry. Unconfirmed. 18 months ago, when this entry was logged, she had read past it without stopping. Unconfirmed had seemed unimportant. Now it seemed like the most important word in the document. She flagged it. She flagged every entry where human mission classification was unconfirmed. There were 39 of them. 39 engagements in which they had never established what the humans had actually been trying to do, because they had assumed they knew, because they had assumed a Tier 4 nuisance species on the losing side of a series of engagements must have been trying to fight. It had not occurred to anyone to ask whether the humans had been doing something else entirely, and the fighting had simply been incidental. She thought about the supply run. 7 soldiers, 40 of hers, supply run. She thought about the recon unit. 6 soldiers, 12 of hers, grid sweep. She thought about a question that had no good answer. If these were incidental, if these were the minor tasks, the routine movements, the boxes being checked on forms she would never see, what were they doing when they were actually trying? She did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid. She had been afraid before, and it had never kept her awake. She did not sleep because she was thinking hard and carefully, and with the full weight of 30 years of strategic experience about a species she had read 11 pages about and underestimated for 18 months. She was trying to build a picture from 47 data points and a lot of missing information, and every time she thought she had an edge of the picture, it turned out to be larger than the frame she had built for it. The room was quiet. The display showed The engagement log. Outside, on the other side of a lot of space, humans were doing things she did not have the intelligence to document. She intended to fix that. She had 48 hours. She planned to use every minute. The translated document had been printed on actual paper, which told me that whoever had sent it either had a sense of humor or access to a very old printer and a commitment to the bit. It was sitting on my field cot when I got back from resupply coordination. Handwritten note on the top said, "Thought you'd find this funny, you were right about the file. V. Yemi, she had contacts in intelligence that she did not explain and I did not ask about." I sat down, I read. The document was titled in translation, Comprehensive Species Assessment. Homo sapiens Behavioral and Military Profile. It was formal, it was thorough. It was the most unintentionally entertaining thing I had read since Private Owen Dre had tried to file in equipment requisition for one good reason to keep going, which the supply system had after a 2-week processing delay denied. I read with a pen, old habit. I put my notes in the margins, given the content. I moved them to brackets. It felt more accurate. Homo sapiens demonstrate an unusual neurological tolerance for sustained threat exposure. They mean we do not run. This tolerance does not appear to diminish with repeated engagement and may in fact increase with accumulated combat experience, suggesting an adaptive stress response that diverges significantly from patterns observed in comparable species. They mean we still do not run and then we get better at it, which they find confusing. Physical capabilities are within standard parameters for bipedal, carbon-based organisms of this size. Glass. No extraordinary sensory, regenerative, or combat-specific biological advantages have been observed. They are politely saying we are very normal animals with nothing special going on physically, which is accurate and somehow more alarming in this context. Strategic capability, however, appears to exceed what physical parameters and species development timeline would suggest as probable. They are saying we should not be this good at this, and they do not understand why we are. I turned the page. Observed human tactical behavior under resource-constrained conditions demonstrates a pattern of improvisation that, while individually unpredictable, produces results that are statistically inconsistent with available resources. Leon and the Uphill Rock. In 17 documented engagements, human units operating with equipment assessed as inferior to VRATI standard achieve outcomes that standard probability modeling assigned a likelihood of below 12%. Below 12%. Leon does math below 12%. Likelihood. I am going to tell him this, and he is going to look exactly as unsurprised as he always does. The document went on for several pages. In this vein, it was the work of analysts who were genuinely trying, in good faith, to understand what they were looking at and who were being defeated by the fact that what they were looking at was not organized along the axes they knew how to measure. They kept reaching for frameworks that almost fit and then did not quite. They kept noting anomalies and then explaining them as anomalies rather than as data. I kept reading. Communication patterns observed within human units suggest a high degree of informal operational decision-making at the individual level with authority Structures that appear to shift dynamically based on immediate situational requirements rather than remaining fixed to formal hierarchy. Yemi with the antenna, Adel through the gaps, Leon with the math. Yes, that is what that is. This informal flexibility creates significant targeting and prediction challenges as human unit behavior cannot be reliably modeled using standard tactical prediction frameworks. I am going to frame this and put it on a wall somewhere. Individual human soldiers demonstrate a willingness to accept personal risk at levels that exceed rational self-preservation calculus, particularly in defense of unit cohesion. They mean we do not leave people behind. They mean that they are writing it in a behavioral science document as though it is a surprising characteristic of an alien species and not a thing most of us decided before we were old enough to vote. I turned the page. I stopped. There was a footnote. Reference. Coordinates that I recognized because I had stood in them, a date I recognized because it had been a bad week, an incident described in the careful, bloodless language of a species threat, assessment stripped of names and context reduced to numbers and outcomes, and the clinical notation of tactical behavior that was inconsistent with species capability profile. 4 human operators, a contested site on a planet whose name I knew very well. 11 minutes. An outcome that the document described as producing results well beyond expected parameters for a unit of this size and designation. I had been one of the 4. I set the document down. I looked at the tin ceiling. There was a water stain on the left side. That had been there since we set up, and that I had looked at many times without thinking about it, and I looked at it now and thought about something I had not thought about in a long time, which was that night and the specific quality of the dark and the weight of what happened in those 11 minutes, and how I had written it up afterward in language that was itself bloodless and clinical because that was the language the forms required, and because the alternative was a language I did not have. 4 operators, that mission, the report I filed. They had found it, they had watched it. They had put it in a file and labeled it anomalous. I picked the document back up. I kept reading. Recommended classification, Tier 4. Nuisance species. No significant resource allocation required. Probability of strategic threat, low. And then at the very bottom of the page, in a format that indicated it had been added as a final note by the document's primary author before submission. Current intelligence gaps in human military structure remain significant. Total force deployment, strategic doctrine, and upper capability limits are not established. Further data collection is recommended before final threat classification is confirmed. The document date was at the bottom of that page. 18 months ago. I sat with that for a while. I sat with the gap between what they had written and what had happened since. 18 months of engagements they had logged, and not apparently used to substantially revise their picture. 18 months of Ratha patrols encountering human units, and the document sitting in a file somewhere with its original classification unchanged, its probability of strategic threat still listed as low, its recommendation still saying no significant resource allocation required. I thought about the Recon unit, 6 of us, that moon, the box I checked on the Form. I thought about 47 engagements happening. In the space between that documents. Date and right now, and a room full of analysts somewhere looking at data they did not have the right frame for. I thought about something that was not funny at all and that I did not put in a bracket. They had been looking at us for a long time. They had been watching since before. Contact tracking, logging, building a file. And somehow with all of that observation, they had arrived at a conclusion that was so wrong it had cost them 47 engagements in 18 months, and they were still catching up to how wrong it was. I did not feel good about that. I want to be clear about that. It is easy from the outside to look at a story like this and feel something simple, something uncomplicated. We won and they lost, and their intelligence was bad and their assessments were wrong, and that is the end of it. But I had read the document, and there was a part of it somewhere in the middle pages, in the section on human psychological profiles, that had described something with enough accuracy that I recognized it from the inside. The section on what the analysts called sustained engagement fatigue, and how human units did not always show this in the ways other species did, and how the suppression of it produced behavioral patterns that were, from the outside, indistinguishable from absence of fatigue. 4 days without sleep, the coffee packet, the box I checked. They had looked at that and called it resilience and marked it as tactically significant. They were not wrong, they had just missed the rest of it, the part that was not resilience, the part that was just exhaustion wearing the only face it had left, which was the face of a person doing the next thing because the next thing needed doing, and there was nobody else to do it. I flipped back to the front page. I read the title again. Comprehensive Species Assessment. I read the classification again, Tier 4 Nuisance Species. And then I read the last line, the one the primary author had added as a note. The one about intelligence gaps in further data collection recommended before final threat classification is confirmed. I thought about whoever had written that, someone who had looked at the data long enough to notice the edges of what they did not know, someone who had flagged it and submitted it and then, presumably, watched it get filed away with its original classification unchanged for 18 months. I hoped they were doing all right wherever they were. Then I put the document in my kit, because intelligence documents do not get left in field tents, and I went to find Yemi to tell her that Private Leon Addy had been performing tactical maneuvers in the bottom 12% of probability likelihood, and she needed to know this immediately. Leon was in the adjacent tent doing the thing he did in the evenings, which was sit quietly and turn the pen over and over in his hands end to end, without looking at it, the way some people handle worry beads. I stopped in the doorway. 12%, I said. He looked up. The uphill rock, I said. They did the math. 12% probability of the outcome we got. He thought about that. He turned the pen over once more. Seems high, he said. He went back to the pen. I went to find Yemi. The 5 of them had been in the chamber for 2 hours before Prince Oreth decided the meeting needed someone to say the thing nobody was saying. The chamber was the kind of room that empires built when they wanted military decisions to feel inevitable, which meant it was large and cold and lit from above in a way that made everyone look like they were already being judged. 5 thrones. 5 prince commanders of the Vrata. Contested sector, each of them with more campaign medals than most soldiers saw in a lifetime, each of them sitting with the particular stillness of people who had been trained never to show uncertainty and were currently extremely uncertain. Intelligence officer Rethvarn had been standing at the display for 2 hours. He had the look of a person who had made his peace with the end of his career and was now simply trying to end it with accuracy. He had been thorough. Oreth gave him that. He had reanalyzed every engagement, reclassified every human unit type, rebuilt the probability models from the revised size estimates. He had done everything that had been asked of him in 48 hours, and he had done it well, and the picture he had produced was very clear and very bad. 47 engagements, human unit sizes ranging from 4 to 12 soldiers across all confirmed contacts. Not a single engagement in 18 months that had involved a human element that could be described by any standard military classification as a significant combat force. Not one. Vrati forces in the contested sector had lost ground, supply lines fortified, positions, and 3 armored patrol units to what the revised assessment now classified with appropriate institutional discomfort as human light elements conducting routine operational tasks. Recon sweep, supply movements forward. Security details, 1 engagement. Vrathai had noted when reviewing the files personally that the human side had apparently classified as a training exercise. A training exercise. Vrathai soldiers had been involved in what human command had later documented as a training exercise, and the outcome had not favored the Vrathai side. Total force deployment, said Prince Vareth. He was the eldest, the most decorated, and had a face that had spent 30 years arranging itself into an expression that made subordinates reconsider their life choices. He was wearing that expression now, and it was being wasted because the display could not reconsider anything. What is the estimate? Rethvarn turned to the relevant projection. We do not have a reliable estimate. Prince Commander. Silence. What we have, Rethvarn continued, with the careful diction of someone walking across ice they had not tested, is a pattern of unit types that are consistent across all 47 engagements, with early deployment light forces, recon elements, forward security, logistics support. We have not encountered in any documented engagement a unit type that corresponds to what human military doctrine would classify as a primary combat force. Prince Vareth said, that is not what I asked. No, Prince Commander, what I am telling you is that I cannot answer what you asked because we have not seen enough of their force to estimate its total size. What we have seen is consistent with the advanced elements that precede a primary force, but I cannot confirm the size of a force I have not observed. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Oreth looked at the display. He looked at 47 contacts, all of them light elements, all of them small units, all of them doing things that in Vrati doctrine were done by the parts of an army that went first, the parts that came before the army itself. He said the thing nobody was saying. We have been losing to their practice runs. Nobody argued, nobody said anything for a moment that lasted long enough to have its own texture. Prince Vareth looked at the display. Prince Sareth, second eldest, who had campaigned in 4 contested zones and had opinions about everything, had no opinions right now. Princes Darren and Sethvara, the 2 youngest, who normally spent the energy between briefing points in low-level competition with each other, were both very still. They were all doing the same arithmetic. Orith could see it happening. They were all looking at the same column of numbers and following it to the same place, which was a question with no answer in the room. If these are the advance elements, what comes after them? We need intelligence, Orith said. Actual intelligence, not probe data. Not long-range observation. We need direct information on human force, disposition, numbers, equipment, doctrine. We have been trying to obtain that, Rithvar said. Have we? Said Orith. Rithvar looked at the table. 2 attempts to secure a human soldier for direct intelligence extraction. The first, the human escaped within 4 hours of capture. Standard security protocols were in place. And the second, Orith said. A pause. The second, the human also escaped, and in the process of escaping, Rethvarn stopped. He continued. 3 Vrathai soldiers who were being held in an adjacent section for medical processing were also removed from the facility. The human took them when she left. Orith looked at him for a moment. She took them? Yes, Prince Commander. Our soldiers? Yes. On her way out? Yes, Prince Commander. Orith looked at the table. He thought about a person escaping a secure facility and while doing so collecting 3 soldiers from a different section, as though they were items she had noticed were out of place and felt responsible for returning. He thought about the supply run. 7 humans, 40 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles supply run. He thought about the Recon unit. 6 humans, 12 soldiers, grid sweep. He thought about the thing he had said, the practice runs comment, and how at the time he had said it he had thought it was probably a slight exaggeration for rhetorical effect. He was no longer sure it was an exaggeration. Send more, he said, for the intelligence operation, more soldiers, better containment. Prince Zareth said, how many more? Orith looked at him. It was a simple question. The problem with it was that the answer was unknown because the answer depended on variables they did not have. It depended on knowing what a sufficient number was, and knowing that required knowing what they were dealing with, and knowing what they were dealing with was the problem they were trying to solve in the first place. How many soldiers does it take to successfully hold 1 human in a secure facility? They had tried standard security for the first one. They had tried reinforced security for the second. The second had left with company. He did not say what he was thinking. He said determine the number and implement it. Rethvan wrote it down. Prince Sethvara, the youngest, who had mostly been quiet, said, there is a second question we have not addressed. Everyone looked at him. He had the energy of someone who knew the thing he was about to say was going to make the room worse, and was going to say it anyway because it needed to be said. If their advance elements are conducting recon sweeps and supply runs, he said, then we should have seen evidence somewhere in the last 18 months of what they are preparing for. Supply concentration, force movement, communication patterns suggesting assembly, strategic targets being soft, cleared in advance of a larger operation. He paused. Have we seen any of that? Rethvan looked at the display. He looked at it for a long time. We have logged communication intercepts, consistent with logistical coordination, he said. But the volume it does not correspond to what we would expect from a force preparing for large-scale engagement. Meaning, Sethvara said. Meaning either the force is smaller than we fear, Rethvan said slowly, or their communication discipline is significantly better than our intercept capability can account for, or... He stopped. Orith said. Or they are not preparing, Rethvan said, for a larger operation, not yet. Not as a deliberate strategic build. The room took that in. Orith said, you are suggesting that this is not a campaign. I am suggesting that I cannot confirm. It is one, Prince Commander, the pattern of activity, the unit types, the mission classifications, the operational tempo. It is more consistent with a species establishing presence in a contested zone, conducting routine security and logistics, and responding to contact as it occurs. It does not have the signature of a species executing a deliberate military campaign. That is worse, said Prince Sarath. Everyone looked at him. A campaign has an objective, he said. It has an end state, you can understand. A campaign anticipated work against it. A species that is simply present, that conducts routine operations, that responds to engagement without escalating to primary force. Commitment, he stopped, that is harder to fight. That is a species that is not losing because they are not in a mode where losing is something they are tracking. The chamber was quiet. Orith thought about the report from the Karath corridor, 40 soldiers, 3 vehicles, a human unit on a supply run. The patrol gone in 11 minutes, the human unit moving northeast, unhurried. Somewhere to be, a supply delivery to complete. The 40 soldiers had been from all observable evidence an interruption, an inconvenience. He thought about the question that Admiral Vetserin had asked in a briefing room several sectors away. A question that had been transmitted to him in the intelligence digest that morning. He thought about how nobody in that room had been able to answer it and how nobody in this room could answer it either. Where is their real army? His communication terminal signaled. He accepted the channel. A field report from the eastern monitoring position, Vrath I. Observation team watching a human forward base. The report was routine. It listed human unit movements, equipment transfers, communication activity. It listed a human patrol departing the forward base, standard complement 6 soldiers, light equipment. The report noted the patrol's departure direction toward the Vrath I secondary supply installation, the one that currently housed 400 soldiers and the sector's primary fuel reserves. Orith looked at the number 6 soldiers. 6 soldiers heading toward 400. He thought about a crater on the moon. 12 and 6, he thought about a corridor. 40 and 7, he thought about 2 numbers arranged in a pattern that had been repeating for 18 months, and how the pattern did not resolve in the direction that the larger number implied it should. He thought 6 soldiers. He thought, I do not know what is coming behind them. He looked at his senior commander. Evacuate the secondary supply installation, he said now. The room went very still. Prince Commander, said Rethvarn. That installation holds. I know what it holds, Orith said. Get our people out of there. Rethvarn began the process. Orith looked at the patrol size in the field report one more time. 6 soldiers. He thought about the Recon unit. He thought about checking boxes on forms. He about a species that filed supply runs under supply runs and grid sweeps under grid sweeps, and had not, as far as he could determine, filed anything under war yet. He ordered the evacuation. He hoped it was not already too late. He genuinely did not know. My niece Nina was 8 years old and had recently developed the opinion that sitting still was something other people did, which meant she was sitting on the porch railing instead of the chair, swinging her feet against the wooden post in a rhythm that had no particular structure to it, just the rhythm of a kid whose legs were too short to reach the floor and who had made peace with this by making the swinging intentional. I had bad coffee. She had something her mother called juice, but which tasted, based on the one sip she had insisted I try, mostly of enthusiasm. Columbus in the late afternoon had that particular quality of light it always had, the kind that came through the trees at an angle that was specific to this place, and no other, golden without being dramatic, like the day was just finishing its work and not making a big thing of it. Nina said, tell me about the war. I drank my coffee. I had been back for 8 months. I had talked about the war in official settings, debriefs, assessments, a medical review that had been more thorough than I expected and less thorough than it should have been. I had not talked about it the way Nina meant, which was the way kids mean it, when they ask, with no armor and no agenda, just wanting to know. What do you want to know? I said. Were the aliens scary? I thought about that. I thought about 12 soldiers in combat, rigs on high ground, targeting systems, locking the particular sound that wrath. I weapons made at range, which was not like the sounds you expected. It was quieter, a kind of displacement of air that your ears registered wrong, that your body knew before your brain caught up. I thought about the intelligence file. Tier 4 nuisance species, I thought. About a room full of very intelligent beings looking at data they did not have the right frame for, trying to understand something that did not fit the shapes they knew. They were scared, I said. That is different. Nina considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to things that adults say which do not mean what they seem to mean. She was going to be extraordinary when she was older. She was already difficult to argue with. Why were they scared? She said. I tried to think about how to say it. Simply, the simplest version of a thing is usually the truest version, and the truest version of this took me a while to find, because they thought they understood us. I said. They had looked at us from very far away for a long time, and they had made a decision about what we were. And then they were wrong, and they did not know how wrong they were for a long time, and by the time they understood how wrong they were, it was very hard to fix it. Nina swung her feet. What did they think you were? Small, I said, not dangerous. But you were dangerous. I looked at the tree in the yard I had planted at the spring before I shipped out, small enough to carry in a bucket. A sapling that had taken in the way some saplings do when the soil and the weather are right and the planting is at the right time. It was substantial now. It moved in the Light wind and the way trees move when they have been growing long enough to know how. We were tired, I said. We were very tired, and we were stubborn, and we would not stop. I think that looked like dangerous from far away. Nina thought about this. I could see her working it through. Tell me about the people, she said. I told her about Leon, not everything. The version you tell an 8-year-old, which is the version that contains the shape of a person without the weight. I told her about the uphill rock, and she laughed, and her laugh was so complete and uncomplicated that something in me that had been holding a particular tension for a long time let go of it a little. I told her about Yemi, not the antenna, just the quality of her, the way she moved through a situation with a kind of comprehensive calm that made you feel that her presence was structural, that she was holding something up just by being in the space. I told her about Claire, who had a habit of checking her boots at the end of every engagement, not for damage, just as a ritual, as a way of confirming that she was still standing. I told her about Otto, who moved through things quietly, finding the gaps. I told her about Bev, who had a gift for the right sentence at the right moment, the one that cut the tension or confirmed the reality or gave everyone permission to exhale. I did not tell her about Owen's habit, the thing he said after engagements, because it was not appropriate for an 8-year-old, but I told her that he had a thing he always said, and that it always helped, and that was enough. Nina listened to all of this. She was a good listener for her age. She took each thing and held it, and did not rush to the next one. Then she said, "Did you win?" I looked at the tree. The war had ended 16 months after that moon, after the Recon sweep that had started all of this. It had not ended with a great battle. There had been no dramatic last stand, no decisive engagement that everyone agreed was the turning point. There had been a series of smaller things, each of which had been from the human side: routine, supply, consolidation, forward position, establishment, sector control, operations, the normal work of being present somewhere and not leaving. And at some point the Vrathi High Command had looked at the arithmetic, the 18 months of engagement data, the evacuated installation, the failed intelligence extractions, the supply run that had cost them 40 soldiers and 3 vehicles, the Recon sweep that had cost them 12 soldiers, and whatever the Vrathi equivalent of pride is, and they had made a decision. They had requested peace talks. The request had come through 7 channels, carefully worded, formally structured. It had said in translation that the Vrathi Empire wished to discuss the cessation of hostilities before the human primary force was deployed. The assumption in that sentence was that the primary force had not been deployed yet. The assumption was that what they had been experiencing for 18 months was, as they had started to suspect, the preliminary layer, the light elements, the advance. Nobody on the human side had corrected that assumption. The negotiations had proceeded. I said we showed up and they panicked. That was pretty much it. Nina accepted this. Why did they panic? Because they thought we were about to do something very large and very serious, I said, and they wanted to stop it before it happened. Were you? The light through the tree was doing the thing it did at this hour, making the yard look like a place that had always existed and would always exist. That had nothing to do with wars or intelligence files or forms with boxes that needed checking. No, I said, we were doing what we always did. Nina was quiet for a moment, then were you scared? I looked at the tree. I thought about 4 days without sleep on that first deployment, the specific quality of the exhaustion that goes past feeling like exhaustion and becomes a kind of clarity or something that wears clarity's face. I thought about a moon with a name I never learned. I thought about the coffee packet that tasted like a description of coffee and checking a box on a form and Yemi packing the antenna components back into her kit with her characteristic neatness and Leon with his pen. I thought about the field with the 40 soldiers in the supply run and Bev saying that went fine in a tone that suggested fine was a thing that happened. I thought about Nina asking the question with no armor and no agenda. I said I was tired, baby. We were all real tired. She accepted this the way she accepted most things I said that were almost answers but not quite, which was by looking at me for a moment with eyes that understood more than 8 years should contain and then moving on. Can I see the tree? She said. You can see it from here. I want to touch it. She climbed down from the railing and ran across the yard with the complete physical commitment that children bring to movement, as though there is no speed other than full speed, no mode between still and going. She put both hands on the trunk and looked up into the branches and said something to herself that I could not hear. I sat on the porch with bad coffee. The light was doing what the light did. The tree was what it was. 8 months back, 1 year of forward deployment, 18 months of a thing that had been classified and reclassified and finally ended in a negotiating room with people choosing their words carefully around an assumption that nobody corrected. Nina came back across the yard. She climbed back onto the railing. It is a good tree, she said. It is, I said. She swung her feet. I drank my coffee. The evening continued in the direction evenings go, which is forward, which is the only direction anything goes, which is enough. I thought for a moment about the moon, the name I never learned, the crater that smelled like burned copper in the form with the box and the 6 of us walking out across a valley floor while somewhere far away a room full of brilliant people looked at the data and began slowly to understand that they had been measuring the wrong things all along. They had been looking for signs of a threat. They had been looking for the shape of an enemy, something they could frame and categorize and assign a probability to. They had been looking for an army. What they had gotten was 6 people checking a box on a form and going to sleep on a shuttle seat with their jackets over their faces. And then 7 people on a supply run. And then 4 people on a thing that got classified in a threat assessment as anomalous and filed away. And then 47 engagements and an evacuated installation and a peace request through 7 channels. And then negotiations and an agreement. And then people going home. I had gone home. Nina was here. The tree was growing. The coffee was bad. I did not need it to be anything else.